In 1942, as the war ground across Europe with familiar brutality, a thin report crossed the desks of German intelligence analysts. It arrived without ceremony, folded into routine traffic from overseas observers. Its claim was simple and immediately suspect. Somewhere in the American Midwest, an aircraft factory was said to be producing heavy bombers at a pace that bordered on the absurd. The figure did not invite debate so much as dismissal. It violated everything Europe believed it knew about industry. Initial estimates were marked accordingly. Exaggeration was the most charitable explanation. Deception, the most likely. America had not yet proven itself in sustained industrial war. Its aviation sector was young, its workforce untested. No serious power, German planners believed, could manufacture complex, four-engine bombers at speed without sacrificing precision. The report was set aside, annotated lightly, its implications safely ignored. But numbers have a way of returning. When analysts revisited the figures, unease replaced confidence. Shipping manifests, labor data, procurement orders, none contradicted the claim. Instead, they aligned with it. Calculations were run again, this time independently. Each produced the same result. According to the data, an aircraft was leaving the assembly line roughly every 63 minutes. That number resisted comprehension. In Europe, a single bomber represented months of labor, the concentrated skill of master craftsmen. Production was linear, fragile, and slow. Disruption meant delay. Loss meant scarcity. Yet this American figure implied continuity, an uninterrupted flow that treated aircraft not as singular achievements, but as output. At first, the analysts searched for the trick. Perhaps the planes were incomplete. Perhaps the definition of finished had been manipulated. Perhaps the count included unusable airframes. None of these explanations held. The logic itself was foreign. It did not reflect how Germans built aircraft, or how Europeans thought about war production at all. Skepticism hardened into concern, not because the number was believed, but because it could not be disproven. The report was revised one final time. The language became cautious. The conclusions were stripped of speculation. And then, quietly, it was forwarded upward, without comment, without recommendation, and without reassurance. Somewhere beyond the Atlantic, something unfamiliar was taking shape, and those reading the report could sense it, even if they could not yet name it. The next packet that reached German intelligence contained no numbers at all, only photographs. Grainy aerial images, taken at altitude, laid out a structure so large it resisted immediate interpretation. Roads curved around it like tributaries. Rail spurs vanished into its frame. This was Willow Run, though the name meant little at first glance. What mattered was scale. The factory did not sit within a city, it functioned as one. Analysts measured shadows, counted roof segments, compared dimensions against known European facilities. The conclusions were unsettling. The main assembly line alone extended farther than several German aircraft plants combined. Where European factories were compact and specialized, this structure sprawled horizontally, optimized not for elegance, but for flow. Distance itself had been engineered into the process. Inside, according to reports, thousands of workers moved in synchronized shifts. They did not gather around completed aircraft in reverent clusters. They passed stations. Each worker performed a narrow task, repeated endlessly, indifferent to the whole. Motion replaced craftsmanship. The human presence was vast, but strangely impersonal, more like circulation than labor. Production did not pause for darkness. Lights burned through the night, pouring from windows in long, unbroken bands. Shifts rotated with mechanical precision. Output graphs showed no seasonal dips, no meaningful interruption. The factory did not sleep, because the war did not require it to. Time had been flattened into a continuous surface. What troubled German observers most was intention. This was not a converted civilian facility. It had not grown organically. The building itself appeared designed around conflict, as if war had been assumed from the first blueprint. There was no ornamental excess, no accommodation for peacetime use. Commerce was incidental. Throughput was everything. German intelligence struggled to classify what they were seeing. It resembled neither traditional manufacturing nor emergency mobilization. It was something else entirely, a purpose-built instrument whose logic did not align with European experience. The photographs were annotated, then annotated again, each pass yielding fewer certainties. This was not familiar industry, and if the factory was real, then the numbers from the earlier report might be as well. The aircraft at the center of every calculation had a name that German analysts quickly learned to recognize: the B-24 Liberator. On paper, it was an engineer's challenge: 4 engines, a high-aspect wing, complex hydraulics, a bomb load that demanded structural compromise. In European terms, this was not a machine meant for haste. It was heavy, intricate, and unforgiving of error. German planners understood aircraft like this intimately. Such bombers required careful sequencing, skilled fitting, and constant adjustment. Production schedules stretched across months. Any increase in speed risked cascading flaws, misaligned components, unreliable systems, crews placed in danger. The assumption was not ideological, it was experiential. Complex machines took time because complexity demanded it. That assumption began to fail the moment American output was plotted against known losses. The numbers refused to align. Raids destroyed aircraft daily, accidents claimed others, weather, flak, fighters each took its share, yet the total inventory did not decline. In some sectors, it increased. Replacement rates exceeded attrition so consistently that losses became statistically invisible. This was not merely efficiency, it was indifference to depletion. Where Germany counted aircraft carefully, America appeared to count time instead. Production graphs climbed steadily, unconcerned with individual outcomes. The destruction of a bomber no longer represented a setback. It represented a momentary imbalance that would correct itself within hours. Quantity began to exert a new kind of pressure. It diluted consequence. Each individual aircraft mattered less, not because it was poorly built, but because it was one of many. The psychological effect was subtle but profound. Pilots could be replaced, crews retrained, airframes regenerated. What had once been irreplaceable became routine. For German intelligence, this forced a recalculation not of technology, but of logic. The Liberator itself was not revolutionary. There was no secret alloy, no singular innovation to neutralize. The threat lay in repetition, in scale, in the relentless predictability of replacement. War had always been measured in skill, courage, and sacrifice. Now, another metric intruded: throughput. And as the Liberators continued to arrive, wave after wave, it became clear that the arithmetic governing the conflict had shifted. Somewhere, far from the front lines, a factory was redefining what loss meant. For decades before the war, German industry had been built on a particular faith. Precision was not merely a method, it was a virtue. The nation's manufacturing identity rested on the belief that quality carefully achieved by trained hands produced superiority that numbers could not dilute. This was especially true in aviation, where tolerances were unforgiving and failure was fatal. Aircraft production reflected this worldview. German factories relied on master craftsmen who understood entire systems, not isolated steps. Components were fitted by hand, adjusted by eye, perfected through experience. Knowledge lived in people rather than processes. The result was aircraft of remarkable performance, admired even by their enemies. To German planners, this confirmed a simple truth: excellence could not be rushed. Quality, in this system, became synonymous with dominance. A better plane, flown by a better trained pilot, was expected to defeat inferior numbers. This belief had precedent. In the early years of the war, it appeared validated daily in the skies over Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. Skill compensated for scarcity. Precision outmatched mass. Scale, by contrast, was treated with suspicion. Large, generalized factories were seen as inefficient, vulnerable, and wasteful. German production remained fragmented, specialized plants producing specialized parts, often scattered across regions. This minimized disruption and preserved craftsmanship, but it also constrained expansion. Growth was incremental. Output increases were negotiated, not engineered. Speed, when it conflicted with perfection, was sacrificed without hesitation. A delayed aircraft that met exacting standards was preferable to a faster one that did not. Errors were corrected individually, not statistically. Each airframe carried the imprint of the hands that built it. Pride was inseparable from the product. For a time, this belief system worked. German aircraft often outperformed their adversaries. Pilots trusted their machines. Engineers refined designs rather than simplifying them. The system reinforced itself, insulated by early success and intellectual confidence. There seemed little reason to question an approach that had delivered victory. What German planners did not yet see was that this logic assumed limits shared by all nations. It presumed that skilled labor would always be the bottleneck, that complexity imposed universal constraints, and that production scaled only by stretching people thinner. These assumptions had governed European industry for generations. But the war was expanding beyond those assumptions. Somewhere across the Atlantic, a different philosophy was taking shape, one that treated imperfection as tolerable, speed as decisive, and human skill as something to be distributed rather than revered. Germany's faith in craftsmanship had carried it far. Now, quietly, it was becoming a liability. From a European perspective, the numbers arriving from America did not merely seem optimistic, they seemed impossible. Industrial expansion on the continent had always come at a cost. Factories were embedded within cities, constrained by geography, labor, and tradition. Any attempt to scale production disrupted everything else. Supply chains fractured, quality slipped, and output often declined before it rose. Skilled labor was the central limitation. Aircraft production depended on workers who required years of training. Their knowledge was tacit, earned through repetition and failure. They could not be replaced quickly, and certainly not en masse. Each additional aircraft required more of these specialists, drawn from an already finite pool. Growth was linear because people were. Bombing intensified these constraints. Allied raids did more than destroy buildings. They erased experience. A single strike could eliminate an entire workshop's worth of accumulated skill. Even when factories survived, transportation networks failed, power was interrupted, and morale eroded. Production slowed not because of inefficiency, but because survival demanded it. In this environment, every aircraft carried weight beyond its material cost. It represented time, training, and irreplaceable labor. Losses were felt immediately. A downed bomber was not an abstract statistic, it was months of effort erased in seconds. German planners absorbed this logic instinctively. It shaped how they counted, how they planned, and how they feared depletion. These assumptions felt universal. No industrial nation, they believed, could escape them. America might have space and resources, but it would still face the same bottlenecks. Skilled workers would remain scarce. Expansion would strain systems. Losses would hurt. The laws of production, like gravity, applied everywhere. This belief shaped every estimate. When intelligence suggested extraordinary output, analysts searched for the hidden cost. Where was the quality loss? Where was the delay? Where was the reckoning? They assumed it was merely unseen, not absent. What they failed to recognize was that America had approached the problem differently from the beginning. It had not tried to stretch a European system across a larger landscape. It had designed a new one. Skilled labor was not treated as sacred. Disruption was anticipated, rather than feared. Bombing was assumed, losses expected, replacement planned. To German planners, production was fragile because it depended on people. To America, it would become resilient precisely because it did not. The numbers seemed impossible because they violated every limit Europe had learned through hardship. They were wrong not about the arithmetic but about the assumptions behind it. From the beginning, American planners made an assumption that few outside their system fully grasped. They did not expect their aircraft to survive the war. Attrition was not a possibility to be managed, it was a certainty to be absorbed. Losses were calculated into projections before the first bomber left the ground. This was not pessimism, it was doctrine. Aircraft, under this logic, were not treated as treasured assets. They were consumables, tools designed for a single purpose, with a finite lifespan measured in missions rather than years. Preservation mattered less than replacement. The question was never how to protect every plane, but how quickly the next one could take its place. This assumption reshaped design itself. Complexity that slowed assembly was stripped away wherever possible. Systems were standardized. Components were made interchangeable. Perfection was no longer the goal. Sufficiency was. An aircraft did not need to be flawless. It needed to fly, carry its load, and be replaced when it did not return. Training followed the same logic. Crews were prepared not as irreplaceable elites, but as part of a continuous pipeline. Instruction emphasized procedure over improvisation, coordination over instinct. Losses, while tragic, did not halt the system. Graduates continued to arrive, squadrons were replenished, experience became institutional rather than personal. Industry itself was redefined. Factories were no longer support structures behind the war, they were weapons within it. Production schedules were treated with the same seriousness as operational plans. Output targets were strategic objectives, delays were failures. Speed became a form of firepower. This perspective felt alien to European observers. It appeared wasteful, even brutal. It accepted destruction as routine and human replacement as inevitable, but it also eliminated hesitation. By assuming the worst, the system was built to endure it. Nothing depended on survival, everything depended on continuity. The logic was cold, but it was coherent. By planning for loss, America made loss survivable. By removing reverence from machines, it multiplied them. By distributing skill across systems instead of individuals, it reduced vulnerability. German intelligence searched for secrets in materials and mechanics. They found none. The real divergence lay deeper in the willingness to design a war economy around disappearance. Planes would fall, crews would be lost, the system would continue, and somewhere within that logic, quietly and relentlessly, the balance of the air war was being decided. The transformation that unsettled German intelligence did not begin with an aircraft designer. It began with an industrialist, whose name was already synonymous with disruption. Henry Ford, long associated with automobiles and moving assembly lines, entered aviation not as a specialist, but as a heretic. He did not ask how airplanes had always been built. He asked why they could not be built differently. Ford approached aircraft production with the same logic that had once reshaped transportation. Complexity, he believed, was not sacred. It was a problem to be dismantled. At Willow Run, bombers were broken down into discrete, repeatable tasks, each one simple enough to be mastered quickly, isolated enough to be measured precisely. The airplane ceased to be a singular object. It became a sequence. Workers were no longer expected to understand the whole machine. They specialized in operations that lasted minutes, sometimes seconds. One set a rivet. Another installed a panel. Another aligned a bracket. Mastery was not deep, but narrow. Skill was no longer rare. It was distributed. Experience accumulated in the line itself, not in individual hands. Interchangeable parts replaced the tradition of hand fitting. Components were manufactured to uniform tolerances, designed to fit without adjustment. If a part failed, it was discarded, not repaired. The line moved forward regardless. Errors were tracked statistically rather than emotionally. What mattered was not that every aircraft was perfect, but that the average aircraft met requirement. Speed became the primary metric of success. Delays were analyzed like mechanical faults. Bottlenecks were exposed and eliminated. Processes were refined relentlessly. If tradition slowed output, tradition was removed. Aviation's inherited reverence for craftsmanship offered no immunity. The assembly line did not negotiate with sentiment. This approach offended established norms. Aircraft engineers resisted simplification. Craftsmen bristled at repetition. Critics warned of mediocrity and danger, but the line continued to accelerate. Output rose not in leaps, but in steady, compounding increments. What had seemed reckless became routine. What had seemed impossible became scheduled. Ford did not invent mass production, he weaponized it. By applying automotive logic to aviation, he collapsed timelines that had once seemed fixed. Months became weeks, weeks became days. The aircraft itself did not fundamentally change, but the context in which it was born did. Aviation had entered the age of mass production, whether it welcomed it or not, and as bombers rolled steadily off the line, it became clear that the battle for the skies was no longer being decided by pilots alone. It was being decided by process. Inside Willow Run, the logic of the automobile factory was no longer an influence, it was law. The assembly line stretched for nearly a mile, bending gently through the plant like a river engineered for flow rather than beauty. Aircraft did not pause for inspection in reverent silence. They moved forward, always forward, pulled by schedule rather than ceremony. The bomber was no longer built as a single object. It emerged from streams of sub-assemblies arriving in constant motion fuselage sections, wings, tail units, control systems each produced independently, each time to meet the line precisely. If one stream slowed, Another surged. Balance was enforced mechanically. The line did not wait for perfection. It demanded continuity. Errors were inevitable, but they were not treated as personal failures. A flawed rivet, a misaligned panel, a defective part, these were not reasons to halt production. They were data points. Patterns were tracked, causes isolated, processes adjusted. Correction happened upstream, statistically, rather than at the point of failure. The aircraft in front of the worker kept moving. Training reflected this philosophy. New workers were not taught to understand aviation. They were taught to repeat an action until it became reflex. Instruction was measured in hours, not years. Competence replaced mastery. The system assumed turnover and designed for it. If a worker left, another could take the position with minimal disruption. Knowledge lived in procedure, not memory. Women filled the line in unprecedented numbers. Many had never worked in heavy industry. They learned quickly. Riveting, wiring, inspection tasks were broken down until physical strength mattered less than rhythm and attention. The workforce expanded not by finding experts, but by redefining what expertise meant. Skill was manufactured alongside the aircraft. Productivity rose in increments so steady they seemed almost modest. Then the curve steepened. Each improvement compounded the last. Bottlenecks disappeared. Output targets were exceeded, then revised. The line did not accelerate dramatically, it simply never slowed. Momentum became its own force. As production increased, something subtle changed in perception. Aircraft ceased to feel rare. They no longer carried the psychological weight they once had. A bomber lost over Europe was tragic, but not paralyzing. Another was already moving down the line. The emotional economy shifted alongside the industrial one. To European observers, this approach felt indifferent, even callous, but it produced results with mathematical certainty. By treating bombers like Model Ts, standardized, repeatable, replaceable America stripped them of fragility. The aircraft was no longer the center of gravity. The system was. And as the line at Willow Run continued to flow, hour after hour, it became clear that this was not simply faster production. It was a different understanding of war itself, one in which victory would belong not to those who built the finest machines, but to those who could build them forever. By late 1942, the data no longer arrived as isolated reports. It arrived as a curve. Month after month, output from American factories rose with quiet consistency. There were no dramatic surges, no single breakthrough to explain it, only steady acceleration. Each production report built upon the last, the line trending upward with a confidence that unsettled those tasked with interpreting it. At Willow Run, the increase was not accidental. Bottlenecks were treated as tactical problems. When a delay appeared, it was isolated, measured, and removed. Tools were redesigned. Workflow was rearranged. Tasks were redistributed. Nothing was considered permanent except improvement. The system learned faster than any individual within it. German intelligence recalculated constantly. Analysts adjusted assumptions, inserted new constraints, searched for the ceiling they believed must exist. Each revision was meant to restore balance to the picture. Instead, it worsened it. Projected totals rose, timelines shortened. What had once seemed an anomaly hardened into a trend. This was the moment when concern turned into something more severe. Bombing campaigns, long considered the corrective force against industrial output, no longer aligned with results. Raids destroyed aircraft on the ground and damaged facilities. But the replacement rate exceeded the damage. What was lost in a day was restored within hours. What was destroyed in a week was absorbed without visible effect. Losses began to lose strategic meaning. In earlier wars, attrition imposed limits. It forced pauses, recalculation, restraint. Now, it simply became input. Destruction fed the system rather than slowed it. The factory responded not with hesitation, but with output. In Berlin, planners struggled to translate this reality into policy. Air defense doctrine had been built around inflicting unacceptable losses. But what defined unacceptable when the enemy did not feel them? Interceptors could destroy bombers, but they could not destroy the curve. Flak could thin formations, but it could not thin production. The psychological effect was profound. War planning depended on friction, on the belief that pressure would produce exhaustion. Yet the American system appeared to grow stronger under stress. The hardware was hit, the more efficiently it responded. Momentum itself became a weapon, indifferent to human cost and immune to traditional counters. This was not superiority of design or daring, it was superiority of process. German intelligence officers could see it plainly now, even if they could not reverse it. The arithmetic had shifted permanently. There would be no equilibrium, only acceleration. Industrial momentum, once achieved, proved unstoppable. And as the curve continued to rise, those watching it understood that the skies over Europe would soon reflect what the graphs already showed. The factory had found its rhythm, and nothing on the battlefield could force it to slow. The change announced itself not in reports, but in the sky. By 1943, Allied bombing raids no longer arrived as isolated thrusts. They came in succession, growing in scale and frequency, until the intervals between them seemed to vanish. Day after day, the formations returned, their routes familiar, their timing relentless. What had once been exceptional became routine. From the ground, the sight defied precedent. Lines of **B-24 Liberator **S stretched across the horizon, their contrails merging into a single, pale ceiling. The formations were not elegant. They were vast. Precision gave way to density. The sky itself appeared occupied, partitioned by altitude and bearing, filled with engines and metal. German air defenses were designed for intensity, not saturation. Flak batteries engaged until barrels glowed, and crews exhausted themselves in rotation. Interceptors climbed to meet the streams, only to discover that there was no edge to the formation, only more aircraft. Every bomber destroyed revealed two more behind it. The tactical problem ceased to be interception and became selection. Which target to engage, knowing it, would not matter. For Luftwaffe pilots, the arithmetic was unforgiving. Each sortie demanded fuel, aircraft, and time. Each engagement carried risk. Yet the bombers returned regardless of losses. Where defenders counted victories, the attackers counted departures. Replacement aircraft filled Allied airfields faster than squadrons could be depleted. The imbalance was not in courage or skill, but in sustainability. Losses mounted on both sides. Bombers fell in flames. Crews were lost. Fighters failed to return, but only one side could absorb this rhythm indefinitely. For Germany, each loss narrowed options. Experienced pilots were irreplaceable. Training hours shrank, squadrons thinned. For the Allies, loss was tragic but anticipated. The flow from factory to runway continued without pause. This disparity reshaped the contest invisibly at first. German defenses still fought with determination. Individual battles were won. Yet the strategic trajectory bent steadily away from them. The cost of resistance rose faster than its effect. Every successful interception consumed resources that could not be replaced at the same rate. Gradually, the balance of the air shifted. Bombing penetrated deeper. Escorts stayed longer. Daylight raids became bolder. The defensive perimeter contracted under pressure not from innovation, but from accumulation. The skies filled not because of a single decision, but because the system behind them allowed no alternative. Air superiority is often described as a matter of tactics and technology. In this moment, it was a matter of endurance. One side could fight today and tomorrow, and the day after that. The other could not. The difference was not visible in any single engagement. It was visible in the calendar. As liberators continued to arrive in unbroken waves, it became clear that the turning point had already passed. The sky was no longer contested on equal terms. It was being occupied. And far from the front, the factories that fed those formations were still accelerating. By 1944, German pilots were still destroying bombers every day. Interceptions were flown with discipline and courage. Flak batteries found their mark. Fighters tore through formations and sent aircraft spiraling down in smoke. On paper, these victories looked substantial. Tactically, they were. Strategically, they no longer mattered. For every B-24 Liberator lost over Germany, replacements were already arriving at Allied airfields. Crews were reassigned. Formations were rebuilt. The rhythm of operations barely changed. Losses that would have grounded earlier air forces were absorbed without pause. The sky refilled faster than it could be emptied. This reality weighed heavily on the men tasked with stopping it. Veteran units of the Luftwaffe flew repeatedly, often multiple times a day. Fatigue became cumulative. Pilots slept poorly, if at all. Aircraft maintenance grew rushed. The physical toll of constant interception was matched by the psychological strain of fighting an enemy that did not diminish. As casualties mounted, replacements arrived with less preparation. Training hours were reduced to meet demand. Fuel shortages, limited flight time. Instruction emphasized survival rather than mastery. New pilots learned just enough to take off, engage, and land sometimes. The institutional knowledge that had once defined German air power began to thin. Skill gave way to exhaustion. Experience was spent faster than it could be replenished. Where earlier combats had been contests of maneuver and judgment, later ones became tests of endurance. The margin for error narrowed as fatigue widened it. Accidents increased. Confidence eroded quietly. The imbalance was now structural. German pilots were fighting not a formation, but a system. Every engagement consumed irreplaceable resources, trained men, fuel, aircraft that could not be restored at the same rate. Every victory carried hidden cost. The factory, by contrast, paid none of these prices. It responded to loss with output, not sacrifice. In this contest, the factory won every engagement it did not attend. It dictated tempo, scale, and replacement. It rendered heroism insufficient. The battlefield extended backward, beyond radar screens and runways, into production schedules and logistics charts that German pilots could neither see nor influence. Gradually, the realization set in. No matter how many bombers were destroyed, the outcome remained unchanged. The pressure did not ease, the formations did not thin, the sky did not clear. The defenders were not losing individual battles, they were losing relevance. The imbalance became permanent, the moment it could no longer be corrected by skill. From then on, every interception was an act of resistance, not reversal. And behind it all, untouched by flak or fighters, the factory continued to decide the war. By the time German leadership fully grasped what they were facing, the window for response had already closed. The reports were no longer ambiguous. Production curves, loss ratios, and sortie counts told a consistent story. This was not a temporary surge or a bluff designed to mislead. It was a sustained industrial reality, and it had matured beyond interference. Countermeasures were proposed with urgency and approved with hope. Dispersal of factories accelerated. Underground facilities were planned. Emergency fighter programs promised technological salvation. But each solution arrived too late, starved of time and coherence. Dispersed production reduced efficiency. New designs demanded training and materials that no longer existed in abundance. The answers multiplied problems faster than they solved them. Resources were shifted desperately. Skilled labor was reassigned from one crisis to another, leaving gaps everywhere. Fuel was diverted from training to interception. Production targets were rewritten monthly, sometimes weekly, chasing a stability that never returned. Strategic focus dissolved into reaction. The system no longer dictated events. It absorbed them. The strategic initiative in the air was lost quietly, without a single decisive moment. There was no announcement, no declaration of defeat. There was simply the growing inability to choose where to fight. Allied bombers appeared where they wished, when they wished, in numbers that no longer invited challenge. Defense became local, fragmented, and exhausted. Bombing penetrated deeper into Germany's industrial core. The Ruhr, once protected by layered defenses, endured repeated strikes. Transportation networks fractured. Power failed intermittently. Repairs lagged behind damage. Factories stood intact, but idle, missing components, workers, or electricity. Production figures declined, not because of destruction alone, but because coordination had collapsed. War production began to unravel under cumulative strain. Output fell unevenly at first, then sharply. Emergency measures masked the decline temporarily, but the trend was unmistakable. Where once Germany had balanced scarcity with skill, now it had neither insufficient quantity. Every decision carried opportunity cost that could no longer be afforded. This was the hardening of the turning point, not a moment, but a condition. The realization that the enemy's strength lay not in what could be bombed, but in what could not be reached. Factories destroyed could be rebuilt. Processes perfected could not be undone quickly. Momentum, once lost, could not be reclaimed. German leadership now understood the nature of the war they were losing. It was not being decided solely by pilots or planners, but by systems set in motion years earlier. The realization came with clarity. and with finality. What could not be stopped was no longer approaching. It had already passed overhead. By 1944, the system had reached maturity. At Willow Run, production no longer surged or stumbled, it stabilized at a pace that would have once seemed fantastical. Processes had been refined to their limits. Delays were marginal. Variations were absorbed. The factory operated not with urgency, but with confidence. Roughly every 63 minutes, a completed bomber left the line. Not ceremonially, not with applause. It rolled forward, was inspected, fueled, and ferried away. Another followed, then another. The interval became routine, measured not in amazement but in expectation. The extraordinary had become scheduled. At this scale, individual aircraft ceased to matter. A bomber was no longer a singular achievement or a fragile asset. It was a unit of output. Its fate, whether it survived 50 missions or none, did not alter the system that produced it. Meaning shifted from the machine to the flow that sustained it. Drama dissolved into mathematics. Losses were recorded, tallied, and replaced. If 10 aircraft failed to return, the deficit was erased within hours. If a week's operations proved costly, the next week compensated. The emotional weight that once accompanied attrition gave way to abstraction. War was being waged in averages. For German intelligence, this reality was no longer contested. Reports continued to arrive, but the revisions stopped. There was little point in recalculating numbers that only grew larger. Estimates converged. Margins of error narrowed. The conclusion no longer depended on precision. Direction alone was sufficient. What remained shocking was not the figure itself, but its implications. An enemy capable of sustaining this pace could not be exhausted by conventional means. Destruction no longer imposed limits. It merely activated replacement. The traditional logic of attrition central to European war planning had lost relevance. This forced a quiet acknowledgement. The contest was no longer between air forces, but between systems. One side measured success in sorties and victories, the other measured it in hours and output. One side fought for advantage, the other manufactured inevitability. At Willow Run, there was no sense of climax. Peak efficiency did not announce itself. It simply persisted. Workers reported, stations operated, aircraft departed. The line continued whether the news from the front was good or bad. Morale fluctuated. Production did not. In this environment, the war's outcome became less a matter of chance and more a matter of duration. Time favored the side that could compress it. Every hour that passed produced another bomber. Every day extended the imbalance. Momentum compounded quietly. German intelligence officers understood now what they had missed earlier. There was no secret weapon to uncover, no innovation to neutralize. The weapon was repetition. The effect was cumulative. The conclusion, once resisted, was now unavoidable. Every 63 minutes, the war renewed itself, and no battlefield decision could interrupt that rhythm. German intelligence spent years searching for the wrong secret. Analysts dissected photographs, technical manuals, wreckage pulled from fields and rivers. They catalogued alloys, measured tolerances, traced wiring runs. The assumption was logical. If American bombers were overwhelming the skies, the explanation must be hidden in the aircraft itself. But there was nothing to find. The B-24 Liberator contained no revolutionary breakthrough. Its engines were powerful but conventional, its aerodynamics competent, not miraculous. In many respects, it was less refined than German counterparts. If judged as a singular machine, it offered little to fear. The real innovation lay elsewhere, beyond the reach of reconnaissance cameras. It existed not in metal, but in method. What Germany confronted was not superior technology, but a different way of thinking about war. America had treated conflict as an engineering problem, one to be solved through systems, flow, and iteration rather than brilliance. Perfection, long prized in European industry, was deliberately abandoned. Not rejected in failure, but surrendered by design. American planners accepted that machines would be lost, crews would fall, and errors would occur. Instead of fighting these realities, they incorporated them. Variability was managed statistically. Loss was normalized. Replacement was assumed. This philosophy inverted traditional hierarchies. Genius mattered less than coordination. Inspiration mattered less than reliability. The system rewarded consistency over creativity, throughput over elegance. Decisions were evaluated not by how impressive they looked, but by how well they scaled. What could not be repeated efficiently was discarded. German intelligence had no framework for this conclusion. Their training emphasized deception, innovation, singular advantage. They searched for the lever that could be pulled to restore balance. But there was no lever, only momentum. The American system did not hinge on any one component. It could not be decapitated. It could only be outlasted. In this environment, systems outperformed individuals. A brilliant engineer could be replaced by a good one supported by process. A skilled pilot could be replaced by a trained one supported by numbers. The loss of talent no longer collapsed capability. It slowed it briefly before it resumed. This realization carried a moral weight that extended beyond the war itself. It suggested that modern conflict would favor those who organized best, not those who fought best. That victory would belong to planners who accepted imperfection and designed around it. That courage and skill, while still necessary, were no longer decisive on their own. The spies had done their job faithfully. They had observed, reported, calculated. What they could not do was reinterpret war fast enough. Their error was not in data, but in perspective. They measured machines when they should have measured time. They studied aircraft when they should have studied factories. Modern war revealed its true master quietly. Not a weapon, not a commander, not even a nation in the traditional sense. It was the system impersonal, relentless, and indifferent to heroism. And once that truth became clear, the outcome no longer depended on surprise. It depended only on how long the system would be allowed to run. German planners entered the war with a confidence shaped by experience. They trusted craftsmanship honed over generations, the accumulated wisdom of engineers and pilots who understood their machines intimately. Skill was cultivated slowly, mastery was earned. In this world, superiority emerged from refinement, doing fewer things better than anyone else. Across the Atlantic, a different faith guided decision-making. America trusted process, not because it dismissed skill, but because it refused to let skill become a constraint. Repetition was valued over virtuosity, consistency over inspiration. Where Germany sought excellence in individuals, America embedded adequacy into systems and let scale do the rest. The contrast revealed itself in what each side chose to count. German planners counted pilots their hours, their victories, their irreplaceable experience. Losses were measured in faces and names. Every casualty narrowed the future. Every veteran loss took years with him. America counted minutes. Minutes per station. Minutes per task. Minutes between completed aircraft. The loss of a pilot was tragic, but it did not halt the system. The loss of a bomber did not alter the schedule. Replacement was not an aspiration. It was an assumption. Time, not talent, became the primary unit of war. In this arithmetic, the factory replaced the battlefield as the decisive arena. Combat remained brutal and uncertain, but its outcomes were filtered through production. Victories mattered less than throughput. Defeats mattered less than recovery. What could be replaced quickly could be risked repeatedly. This did not make the war impersonal. It made it relentless. Courage was still required in the air. Sacrifice was still demanded. But neither could compensate for a system designed to regenerate faster than it could be depleted. Organization eclipsed brilliance. Momentum outlasted heroism. The implications extended beyond any single campaign. Modern war, it became clear, would reward those who could design for loss without collapsing, who could accept imperfection without paralysis, who could subordinate pride to output. The moral discomfort of this realization lingered, but its effectiveness could not be denied. At Willow Run, there were no grand speeches announcing victory. The line continued as it always had. Workers arrived, stations operated, aircraft departed. The rhythm did not change because it had never depended on circumstance. It depended on design. German intelligence officers had once read a report they thought was wrong. The figure seemed impossible. One bomber every 63 minutes. It violated experience. It defied intuition. It contradicted everything European industry had taught them about limits. But the report had been accurate. The mistake lay not in the number, but in the framework used to judge it. They measured what had always mattered before. America measured what would matter next. Victory did not arrive with a single decisive blow. It accumulated quietly, hour by hour, aircraft by aircraft. The war's outcome was shaped not only by those who fought, but by those who organized the fight behind them. They thought it was impossible. Then it rolled off the line every 63 minutes.